Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. It was the kind of Lagos morning that wore a false smile. Bright sky, soft breeze, but tension bubbling just beneath the tarred roads and tinted car windows. The city was already stretching its jaws wide, ready to chew people whole, as it always did. But inside the quiet, high-walled estate in Ikoyi where William sat, the air was still, unnaturally so. The kind of stillness you find in a courtroom just before the verdict. He sat at the back seat of a Lexus SUV, eyes fixed on the white duplex ahead, the house he once shared with Leona. His throat was dry, but not from thirst. It was the kind of dryness that comes when your heart is dragging its feet behind you, unsure if it should follow your body. His lawyer, Say Becker, sat beside him, a man whose expression carried the fatigue of fighting other people's battles for too many years. With horn-rimmed glasses sliding down his nose and fingers thumbing through thick divorce documents, he looked more like a tired professor than a top-tier Lagos divorce attorney. "Once we walk in, she signs, you sign, we're done," he said. 30 minutes, tops. No room for drama, Will. Keep your words few. William nodded, but didn't answer. His mind was a forest of unfinished memories. Late-night whispers with Leona in Abuja when they first met, the way she used to hum to herself while cooking barefoot, and then the silence that swallowed her the day her brother, Raymond, died. That silence had stayed, grown, spread like fog between them until nothing could be seen clearly anymore. William swallowed hard, his Adam's apple moving like a reluctant elevator. The papers Say he held had weight, maybe not in grams, but in consequence. The kind of weight that doesn't rest on your hand, but your conscience. He was here to end things, but there was a part of him that wasn't convinced things had even fully begun. Not really. The estate gate opened a little slower than usual, as if it too was hesitant about what the morning might bring. A sleepy gateman in brown uniform waved lazily, not even pretending to care who was entering. Say eased the SUV forward and parked a few meters from the front door. William didn't move. His eyes traced the lines of the familiar building, white paint still fresh, flowers trimmed with care, the windows spotless. Nothing had changed on the outside, but he knew that behind those curtains were 7 months of silence, layered like dust on unused furniture. Leona had not been seen in public since Raymond's funeral in Port Harcourt. Not at charity events, not at business summits, not even on social media. It was as if she had pulled her existence off the shelf and locked it in a drawer. Back then, the police ruled Raymond's death an accidental overdose, but everyone knew Raymond wasn't built like that. He was a straight line in a world of crooked systems, too straight for his own good. That funeral had cracked something open between them. William hadn't attended. He hadn't even called. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to care in that moment. Regret had visited him in waves ever since, each one pulling him deeper. But today was not a day for apologies. Today was for closure, or so he thought. As Say reached for the door handle to step out, William put a hand on his arm. "Wait," he said, voice low. Something was off. The air had shifted. That invisible heaviness you feel just before a storm, even when the sky is blue. The sound came first. Low, rumbly, like distant thunder that refused to die. William turned his head slowly, and then he saw them. 4 black Toyota Land Cruisers rolling down the narrow estate road in quiet formation. It was a scene plucked straight from a political movie, only this wasn't fiction. Each SUV moved deliberately, like a funeral procession with somewhere very specific to be. There were no flashing lights, no sirens, just the hum of expensive engines and tinted windows that revealed nothing. William's blood ran cold. Say muttered a curse under his breath, his briefcase already forgotten on his lap. The first SUV parked in front of their car, the second behind, the third diagonally across the street, and the fourth right at the estate exit. The road was locked down like a high-stakes sting operation. Neighbors peeked through their blinds. A man walking his dog stopped mid-stride, the leash hanging loose in his hand. Even the gateman dropped his phone. Then, the second SUV's back door opened, and Leona stepped out. Slowly, deliberately. She wore a burnt orange kaftan that moved with the breeze, like fire dancing across water. Her face was framed by dark glasses, but her posture said everything her lips didn't. She was not here to beg, to weep, or to explain. Behind her walked 3 women. One tall and regal, likely her aunt. Another lean and sharp-eyed, maybe her friend from the ministry. The third, unknown, younger, eyes scanning everything. They moved like guardians behind a queen. No one spoke. No one needed to. The weight of the moment spoke louder than sirens ever could. William felt his knees weaken. Leona had always known how to make an entrance, but this was different. This was a declaration of war, dressed in silence. She didn't walk to him. She didn't wave. She didn't even glance in his direction. Instead, she walked straight past him, up to the house they once shared, and opened the door herself with a key he had forgotten she still had. Her convoy stayed where it was, idling like shadowy witnesses. Say turned to William, eyes wide, disbelief painted all over his face. "This is not a divorce," he said under his breath. "This is a message." William didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind had emptied out, like a vault thrown open during a robbery. He followed her slowly, almost in a daze. His shoes clicked against the driveway like they were tapping out a warning. Inside, the house smelled of lavender and thyme. Clean. Too clean. As though it had been scrubbed of every trace of memory. Leona stood in the center of the living room, arms crossed, glasses off now, eyes sharper than any lawyer's. "You came to end it," she said, her voice calm, even soft. "Good. Let's end it properly." William stood there, unsure whether he was inside a house or a story being written without his permission. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to be over in 30 minutes. William remained standing a few feet from the doorway, uncertain whether he was meant to follow her in or wait like a guest who had arrived without invitation. His hands hung at his sides, heavy, useless. The house was too quiet, eerily so. Even in its silence, it vibrated with something unspoken, something unfinished. He felt like he had stepped into a memory that wasn't his anymore. Leona moved with the ease of someone who had long rehearsed this moment. She walked to the center of the living room and stood there, not looking at him, not inviting him to sit. There was no smile on her face, not even the kind you offer out of politeness when confronting the past. Her arms crossed slowly, but her eyes did not blink. William glanced around. The paintings on the wall had changed. The warm yellows and vibrant reds they had once chosen together were gone, replaced now with darker, cooler tones. Heavy brushstrokes of gray and black. There was a new clock, too, one of those silent kinds that ticked without sound, as if time itself was ashamed to announce it was passing. The furniture was the same, yet nothing felt familiar. It was as if she had exorcised everything he ever touched, without removing the structure. The shell remained, but the soul had moved on. He finally took 2 steps forward, but his feet felt like bricks. "Why the convoy, Leona?" he asked, voice catching in his throat like a spoon scraping metal. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing, not in anger but in careful calculation. "To make sure you didn't walk away halfway through this," she said, her tone even. "And to remind you that I don't stand alone anymore. Not in grief. Not in silence." He didn't expect that answer. Not that it shocked him, but it cracked open a discomfort he had tried to bury. A discomfort that came with the realization that this woman, the same one who once curled up on his chest whispering dreams, was no longer standing in front of him as a wife. She was something else now. Maybe a reckoning. Maybe a mirror. Maybe both. He ran a hand over his face, not to hide his confusion, but to feel something real. The air inside the room felt charged, like static before lightning strikes. He wanted to sit, but didn't dare ask. Leona turned slowly, her gaze finally meeting his. "You want to end things? Then look me in the eye while you do it," she said. "Don't hide behind paperwork. Don't hide behind say. I want you to end it the same way you disappeared, fully conscious and without excuse." William swallowed. The word sat bitter in his mouth. "You make it sound like I vanished into smoke," he murmured. "You did," she replied, swift and sharp. "The night Raymond died, I waited for your call. Even if you didn't come to Port Harcourt, I expected at least your voice. But you gave me nothing. Not even breath." She walked toward the dining table and picked up a slim file, untouched until now. "Let's talk properly before we sign anything," she added. "You owe me that much." William nodded slowly, almost in defeat. He followed her steps like a shadow trying to keep up with its light. The floor beneath him felt different, cooler, distant. The table was already set with 2 glasses of water, untouched, and 1 closed envelope. He didn't ask what was inside. He already knew it would change things. They sat across from each other, the table between them suddenly feeling more like a border wall than a dining piece. William couldn't read her face. It wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. It was still, like the surface of a lake hiding a storm beneath. Leona placed her palms on the table gently, fingers spread as though she was about to pray. But instead, she said, I want to ask you a question. One you've never answered, not even in your silence. William leaned forward, instinctively bracing himself. Did you really think Raymond's death was just another tragedy in a long list of Nigerian failures? The question hit harder than he anticipated. He blinked. I didn't know what to think, Leona. The autopsy said overdose. You didn't speak to anyone. You locked yourself in here. You thought I went mad, she cut in. Not loud. Not angry. Just factual, like reciting weather conditions. I heard what they said. That I became unstable. That I needed help. What I needed was someone who believed me. She reached for the envelope and slid it toward him. You want truth? Open this. William hesitated, then picked it up. Inside were 3 photographs. One of Raymond sitting at a table with 2 men William recognized from oil board meetings. Another of a printed email with subject line, "Too close to blow the lid?" And the third, an autopsy report different from the one police issued. William stared, words failing him. He came to me before he died, she said quietly. Told me he had found something big. A leak. A scandal that could ruin several names, including one close to you. He said he was scared. That he needed protection. She exhaled slowly. Then 2 days later, he was found dead. And you never came. William dropped the photos back onto the table like they burned his fingers. I didn't know, he whispered, voice cracking. I swear, Leona, I didn't know. She stared at him a long moment, searching his face the way a surgeon studies a wound before deciding where to cut. Maybe you didn't, she said, but you didn't try to know either. And that's just as dangerous. Her voice was calm, but it carried a weight that pressed down on his shoulders. You were too busy protecting your name, your peace, your place in a world where silence is safer than suspicion. She stood slowly, her chair making no sound, as if the room itself respected the gravity of what had been said. William remained seated, the silence between them expanding into something tangible. A wall, a chasm, a punishment. Leona walked to the window and pulled back the curtain. Outside, the convoy remained still. The engines purred like beasts waiting for their master. The 3 women hadn't moved. She turned her head slightly. You thought you were coming here for a simple ending. But sometimes, what we call endings are actually awakenings in disguise. She paused. And sometimes, what we try to bury finds its own way back to the surface. William leaned back in his chair, hands covering his mouth. He wasn't just here for a divorce. He was here for a confession. Maybe even a judgment. But the question burning in his mind now wasn't how it would end. It was whether he'd be able to leave at all. Not just physically, but emotionally. Because Leona hadn't just invited him into her home. She had dragged him into the very heart of everything he had tried to forget. The air inside the room had changed, though neither of them moved nor spoke for a full minute. William stared at the envelope in front of him like it might hiss and bite him at any moment. What sat there wasn't just paper and ink. It was the crumbling edge of the version of truth he had held on to for months. Leona remained by the window, but her gaze wasn't fixed on the convoy outside anymore. Her eyes were far away, sunk deep into a place only she could access, where grief had taken root and refused to let go. She didn't need to shout to make her pain heard. It sat in the air like perfume that wouldn't fade, lingering in the corners of the room, settling between the folds of their silence. William finally reached for his glass of water, his hands unsteady. The water barely touched his lips before he set it down again. His throat felt clogged, not by thirst but by shame. He had come into this house with the intention of folding up a failed marriage like laundry and moving on with clean hands. But now he realized he had walked into a courtroom without realizing it, and he was both defendant and witness. Leona turned slowly, leaned against the wall, and crossed her arms. The thing about truth, she began, is that it never asks for permission to arrive. It doesn't knock. It doesn't respect timing. It just shows up. Her voice was calm but layered, as though she had rehearsed these lines for months, waiting for the right moment to release them. And when it does, you either face it or you run. William wanted to say something, anything, but every sentence he attempted in his head died on his tongue before reaching his lips. He felt like a man swimming against a tide he didn't even know existed until it pulled him under. He looked at her again and saw someone familiar, yet entirely new. Leona had always been fierce, but this version of her was forged. Hardened not out of anger, but by survival. She wasn't here for validation. She had long passed that stage. Now she was here simply to unveil, to uncover what had been buried beneath their silence and distance. William leaned forward, hands pressed together like someone caught between prayer and negotiation. "You said Raymond came to you. Told you everything. Why didn't you come to me?" The question sounded defensive even to him, and he regretted it as soon as it left his mouth. But Leona didn't flare up. She gave a soft, mirthless laugh that held more pain than humor. "I did, William. I tried. You didn't see it because you were too busy convincing yourself that peace meant silence. That if you didn't ask questions, then no answers could hurt you." Her tone didn't rise, but each word carried weight. "I sent messages. I called you. I even sent the initial copies of those documents to your private inbox. You never opened them. And when I called your assistant in Abuja, she said you were too busy dealing with board affairs to handle personal matters. That's when I realized I was alone in a boat that was already leaking, and you were watching from the shore with dry feet." William's face tightened as the shame burned deeper into his skin. He remembered those days now, the excuse of being overwhelmed, the mental exhaustion he used as a barrier. He had thought she'd come around eventually. He hadn't imagined she was standing in quicksand while he debated whether to reach out. The conversation shifted now from accusations to unwrapping. Slowly, like peeling old wallpaper to reveal a wall too weathered to repaint. Leona moved to a cabinet near the study and returned with another file, this one labeled with a name he didn't recognize, Ekazona Awil. She dropped it gently on the table between them, but it felt like a hammer landing. "This is the man who sent Raymond the final warning," she said. "He used to be a junior partner in one of the oil subsidiaries your company holds shares in. Raymond discovered a trail, a funding loop used to launder over 200 million naira through project proposals that were never executed. This man's name came up in almost every trail. Guess whose signature was on 2 of the approval letters?" She opened the file and pointed at a page. William leaned in and saw his signature, copied and pasted under a scanned company letterhead. His breath caught in his chest. "This is forged," he muttered. "I've never seen this document in my life." Leona nodded. "I figured. I verified it. The stamp is real, but the ink's age didn't match the timeline. They used your position to shield their trail. Raymond wanted to go public. He said the truth didn't care about how many powerful names it rattled." She paused, her voice lowering. He was scared but brave. "And I told him I'd protect him. That I had someone I could trust. That you'd listen." The word "you" hung between them like a ghost. William leaned back, eyes closed. That ghost wasn't just the truth anymore. It was the realization that his absence had become the nail in someone else's coffin. He had been the wall she ran into when all she needed was a door. Outside, the engines of the convoy still hummed softly. Not in a rush. Not impatient. They waited like shadows loyal to grief. Leona stood once more and moved toward the bookshelf, her hands brushing over spines she knew too well. She picked out a small black journal and held it close to her chest for a second before offering it to him. "This is Raymond's," she said. "It's the last thing he wrote in before he died. It's not just evidence. It's him, raw, paranoid, determined, hopeful, still believing someone would listen." William accepted it with trembling hands, as though afraid it might disintegrate upon touch. He opened to the first page and saw Raymond's handwriting, small, hurried, written in blue ink. The first line read, "If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident. It'll be a message." William closed the journal quickly, unable to read more. The walls seemed to inch closer, the room heavier now, swollen with words that had waited too long to be said. Leona watched him but didn't press. The truth had been laid bare. Whether he chose to pick it up fully or pretend to walk around it was now entirely on him. The silence stretched again, no longer empty, but full of consequence. A silence made not of ignorance, but of realization. William stared at the journal, then at her. "Why show me all this now?" he asked, his voice hollow. Leona answered without hesitation. "Because I'm letting go of everything I used to carry, including waiting for you to care." She turned toward the hallway, walking away without sound, leaving him behind with the truth, and the silence it no longer needed to explain itself. The journal sat on the table like a ticking clock, yet neither of them reached for it again. William stared at it without seeing, his eyes fixed but unfocused, like someone trying to decipher meaning from an unfamiliar language. His shoulders had dropped, no longer braced for war, no longer pretending to carry dignity. The cracks had shown, not as loud breaks but as slow crumbling, one truth, one page, one sentence at a time. Across the room, Leona remained silent, arms at her sides, her body still except for the faint rise and fall of her chest. The distance between them now felt like two countries staring across a sea, once united by maps drawn in affection, now separated by storms of what was left unsaid. Outside, the clouds above Akoi had thickened, casting faint shadows into the room through the blinds. The dull gray light made the walls appear colder, like the house itself was eavesdropping. William leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely like a man about to pray, but too proud to kneel. "If you showed me all this to punish me, you've succeeded," he said eventually, voice low, like it didn't belong to him. "But if you showed me because you still wanted me to fix something, I don't even know where to begin." Leona didn't blink. "It's not punishment," she said. "It's a funeral, and I needed you to attend this one." The words hit him square in the chest, sharp but fair. She wasn't seeking revenge. She had brought him to witness the burial of their silence, of everything that festered between them in absence and fear. This was the wake before the departure, and he had only just realized it. He stood up slowly, like the weight of truth had settled into his spine, making each movement deliberate and sluggish. His footsteps across the floor felt different now, less like trespassing, more like wandering in a familiar place where the furniture had changed. He reached the window and parted the curtain slightly. The convoy was still there, unwavering. 4 SUVs. Black, still heavy. The 3 women who came with Leona remained visible, sitting inside with patient faces and folded arms. They weren't here for spectacle. They were here for witness. William let the curtain fall back into place, sighed deeply, and turned to face her. "When I left this house," he said, "I told myself that silence was better than fighting. I told myself that time would soften everything. But time didn't heal anything. It just buried it deeper." Leona stepped forward, not with aggression but with steadiness, her voice still quiet but firm. "You told yourself a lot of things, William. But none of those things made it easier for me to sleep at night, knowing Raymond was dead and no one would listen to me. I screamed in places where my voice became background noise. You think silence was your way of coping? It was my prison." Her tone did not accuse, it revealed, like peeling back fabric to expose the scar beneath. William closed his eyes for a moment, forcing himself to see the truth not just on paper, but in her. The woman who once sat beside him in board meetings, fingers intertwined under the table. The woman who defended his name even when others whispered. Now she stood in front of him, not demanding love, not even respect, just understanding. And maybe beneath all of it, the dignity of being heard after so long of being ignored. "Why now?" he asked. "Why today, after months of nothing?" She looked at him with eyes that held years, not months. "Because I couldn't let you leave this marriage thinking you did everything right." They sat again, this time without ceremony. The house no longer felt like a courtroom. It had become something else, an autopsy room for a love that didn't survive its own silence. William finally opened the journal and began to read, page by page. Raymond's handwriting was fast, chaotic, at times hard to follow, but the emotion bled through the ink. Notes about suspicious meetings in Port Harcourt. Timelines of offshore transactions. Names. Accounts. He'd been deeper into the conspiracy than William had realized, dangerously so. Raymond's final pages were more erratic, phrases underlined, some scratched out. But one sentence repeated in different versions. "If I die, let them know I didn't die by mistake." William's jaw clenched, the pages trembling slightly in his hands. He felt something break, not loud, not dramatic, but internal, like a snapped string on a guitar that no longer played its full note. Leona watched him without interrupting. Her patience wasn't passive. It was earned. She had walked this road before him, alone, barefooted through shards of betrayal and grief, and now she stood waiting to see if he would at least finish the walk with his eyes open. William closed the journal and placed it back on the table like it was sacred. "He trusted me," he whispered. "He trusted me, and I let him drown." Leona nodded. "You did. And I trusted you too. And I drowned beside him." The words weren't thrown. They were laid down like bricks in a path he should have walked long ago. She wasn't here for apology. She was here to name what had been done, so it would no longer haunt her in silence. The storm broke outside, just after the last word left her mouth. Rain hit the roof with a suddenness that made them both look upward, as if expecting it to crash through the ceiling. Lagos rain didn't arrive with polite warnings. It barged in, washing away dust and secrets alike. The sound filled the room, not enough to drown conversation, but enough to blur the edges of everything else. Leona stood and walked to the window, watching the raindrops race each other down the glass. William didn't move. He sat, palms resting on his thighs, the echo of her last words ringing louder than the storm. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't begging. And that, perhaps, was what unsettled him the most. He had expected resentment, maybe even rage. What he got was clarity. A woman who had faced grief head-on, and refused to let it twist her into something ugly. Leona turned to him again, her voice almost softer than before. You came with your lawyer to end this marriage. But I brought you something else entirely. I brought you the truth. The part that you were never brave enough to ask for. She paused as the thunder rumbled in the distance. And now that I've said it, I'm not holding it anymore. I'm releasing it. Whether it breaks you or saves you, that's no longer mine to carry. William stood slowly, walking toward her like a man stepping out of a cave into light that burned. He didn't reach for her. He didn't apologize. He simply nodded, as if to say, I see it now. I hear it. She gave him a long look, then glanced down at her watch. They'll be waiting, she said, referring to the convoy. Then she added, almost to herself, and I'm ready now. The storm outside continued to clap its wet hands against the windows, but inside the house, the sound had faded into the background like a distant drumbeat. William followed Leona into the hallway, his steps hesitant, as though he were walking not across tiles but across years of mistakes he hadn't realized had been carved into the floors. Each framed photograph on the wall carried a silence of its own, a frozen version of who they once were. One image showed them laughing, arms around each other, during their engagement in Abuja, unaware of what the years ahead would demand from them. Another captured Raymond, head slightly tilted, eyes bright, the three of them standing beneath a jacaranda tree in Port Harcourt. Those moments were embalmed in glass now, untouchable, unreachable, and yet present like ghosts who refused to leave the building. Leona stopped near the guest room door, but she didn't open it. Instead, she turned to face him, and her eyes held the kind of finality that didn't beg for acceptance. After Raymond died, this house became unbearable. I'd wake up hearing his voice, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in my own head. Grief makes architects out of pain. It builds walls where there were none, and puts locks on doors that were once open. I stopped recognizing my own reflection. I was angry, but not just at the world. I was angry at myself for thinking you would come, for thinking you'd fight for what mattered when silence was the easier shield. William didn't speak. There were no words that could wrap themselves around what she'd lived through. He knew now that his absence had spoken louder than he'd ever meant for it to. She walked past him, gently brushing his shoulder with the edge of her sleeve as she did. The hallway stretched behind her like a runway, and he stood there, feeling like someone who had missed their flight. He followed her back into the living room, where everything looked unchanged, and yet nothing felt the same. The walls no longer held memories, they held testimonies. The couch they once sat on to binge old sitcoms now looked like it belonged to strangers. William picked up the divorce documents that still sat on the edge of the coffee table. His name sat above the blank signature line, as if daring him to reduce everything to ink. I still don't know if signing this will make anything better, he said, almost to himself. Or if it's just something we do to pretend we've moved on. Leona sat, her posture relaxed now, not from comfort, but from the weight she had finally set down. Closure is a myth, Will. We don't close chapters, we carry them. What changes is how heavy they feel over time. Her voice was no longer edged with pain. It had found something steadier, like a river returning to its course after a flood. William looked at her hands, fingers folded neatly on her lap. There were no rings now, no trace of what they once exchanged under a chapel roof. Just bare hands, strong hands, hands that had written through grief and dug through lies and still reached for clarity. He placed the documents back down and rubbed his face slowly. If I sign this, I want to do it knowing that I finally saw you. Not as the woman I built in my mind, but the one you became when I wasn't looking. Leona tilted her head slightly, her lips pressing into something that could have been a smile if the air were less heavy. Then see me now, Will. Not as a memory, not as a mistake, but as someone who survived what she didn't ask for. I loved you. I gave you all I had. But when it was time to stand beside me, you chose the comfortable silence of men who don't want blood on their shoes. She stood, walked to the shelf, and brought out one last item, a framed quote she had once hung in their bedroom but had since moved. She handed it to him. The glass was slightly cracked on one corner, but the words were clear. If you are silent about your pain, they will kill you and say you enjoyed it. Chinua Achebe. William read it once, then again. The crack in the frame seemed deliberate now, like an exclamation mark drawn by fate. He told me that quote once, he said quietly. Raymond. He said it after a board meeting, joking that we were all cowards in suits. Leona gave a small nod. He wasn't wrong. The air between them shifted once more, not softened, not hardened, but simply clarified. They had arrived at the final bend in their road, and neither one of them was pretending anymore. William took the pen from the table, held it loosely, then slowly signed his name. The ink slid across the page as if even it understood the weight of the moment. He handed it back to her without looking. "There," he said. "It's done." Leona took it gently, folded it, and placed it inside a brown envelope, sealing it with care. Not triumph, just completion. Rain continued to fall, but softer now, like a drum roll that had given way to quiet applause. Outside, the convoy remained steady, headlights blurred by droplets. The house had grown dim, and neither of them bothered to turn on the lights. Leona picked up her bag and adjusted the scarf wrapped around her shoulders. It was the same color as the kaftan she wore, rust and gold, like evening skies over the Niger. She glanced at William one last time, her face unreadable but not cold. "I'm not walking away because I stopped loving you," she said. "I'm walking away because I started loving myself enough to stop waiting." She moved to the door, her footsteps soft but certain. William followed a few paces behind, not to stop her, not even to speak, just to witness. The front door opened with a small creak, and the scent of wet leaves drifted in. The woman who stepped outside was not the same one who stood beside him at wedding altars or company fundraisers. She was a woman shaped by survival, tempered by fire, and wrapped in the dignity of someone who chose truth over comfort. The first SUV door opened, and one of the women stepped out to greet her. William stayed on the porch, hands in his pockets, watching as she entered the vehicle without once looking back. No dramatic pause, no final glance, just forward movement. The door shut. The convoy pulled away with slow grace, disappearing into the Lagos rain like a story whose final chapter had already been written. And as he stood alone beneath the dripping edge of the roof, William realized some storms don't come to destroy. They come to reveal who built their house on sand. The rain had stopped by morning, but the air still carried its scent, fresh, heavy, and unsteady. Water clung to the hibiscus leaves in front of the house like tears refusing to fall. Inside, the silence had settled deeper than before. It no longer felt like the silence between two people, but the kind that lingers in places after something important has left. William stood in the middle of the living room where so much had unraveled, his hand resting on the back of the chair Leona once sat on. He hadn't moved much since the convoy disappeared. Even sleep had been a stranger to him. The files were still on the table. The journal remained closed, though its contents had tattooed themselves into his mind. He walked slowly to the dining area, not to eat. He had no appetite, but to sit and listen to the stillness. It was strange how a space could become unfamiliar in a single day. The house no longer felt like his. It felt like a stage after the actors had left, and all that remained was the set, lifeless, stripped of meaning, too quiet to pretend anymore. The photographs were still on the wall, but he avoided looking at them now. They felt more like exhibits than memories. He closed his eyes and tried to recall the sound of her laughter, something he hadn't heard in nearly a year. It came back faintly, like an echo traveling from the far end of a canyon. He had once built a life with that sound in it, and now all he had left was the aftertaste. That afternoon, he returned to his office in Victoria Island, walking into the space like a man sent to pack up a life that had already been declared lost. His assistant greeted him with forced brightness, asking whether the meeting had gone well. He offered a nod without meaning it. His corner office still bore the markers of a man in control: glass desk, polished floors, files arranged with clinical precision, but he now saw everything differently. It was as if his eyes had adjusted to a new kind of light, one that revealed how much he had hidden even from himself. He pulled out the leather drawer and brought out a folder marked Raymond IB, Community Projects, one he had tossed aside months ago without opening. As he flipped through it now, guilt spread through his chest like ink spilled on white fabric. There were proposals, handwritten notes from Raymond, some stamped with urgency. One memo even had a scribbled request to speak directly with William, highlighted, underlined, ignored. He pressed a palm against his forehead and shut the file. The walls of the office felt narrower somehow. His mind drifted back to the day he had ignored Leona's fourth call. He'd been in that very room, nodding along to a presentation while her name blinked silently on his screen. He had told himself then that he'd call back later. But later had become never, and never had grown claws. His phone buzzed suddenly. A message from Bar. Say Bakar, Documents finalized. No complications. William replied with a simple thank you, then placed the phone face down. The finality didn't sting. It just sat there, quiet, undeniable, like wet cement drying in his chest. Over the next week, he found himself driving aimlessly after work, often ending up in places that once held meaning. The beach road near Lecce, where he and Leona used to sit in the car just to hear the waves crash against the shore. The coffee shop on Ballarat Musa Crescent, where she would meet her friends, always arriving late, always with a book under her arm. These places were still there, untouched by their absence, carrying on as if nothing had changed. He parked outside the foundation office she used to run and watched from the car as a few volunteers moved in and out, holding boxes, carrying files. The nameplate still bore her full name, Leona Ives, but he suspected it would be changed soon. He didn't get out. He didn't even lower the window. Just sat there until dusk slipped in through the car and swallowed the day. People often spoke of heartbreak like it was loud, messy, theatrical. But the kind he now lived with was quiet, subtle, like a slow leak in the ceiling. You don't notice it until the damage becomes undeniable. His reflection in the rear-view mirror looked tired, as if it too was trying to remember who he used to be. Somewhere between that mirror and the steering wheel, he made peace with the fact that he had been wrong. Not just in action, but in posture. He had convinced himself that not interfering was respect, that silence was strength. But what he had offered was distance, and what she needed was presence. And now he had none to give. Weeks turned into a month. The world didn't stop. It never did. The streets filled again, the air buzzed with Lagos noise, the daily dance of ambition and exhaustion resumed. But for William, everything was slightly slower, as if time was now walking beside him instead of dragging him forward. News broke online. An independent audit of an oil consortium in Abuja had led to multiple arrests. Among the headlines was the name Ekazona Awil. The story mentioned a whistleblower whose documentation had triggered the chain reaction. It didn't name her, but he knew. In the quiet corner of the web, a clip surfaced, Leona speaking on a podcast from Nairobi, her voice steady, her eyes no longer burdened. She talked about institutional silence, personal healing, and the cost of truth. She didn't mention Raymond by name. She didn't mention William either. But she spoke with a clarity that told him she had finally stepped out of the long, haunted hallway of grief. He listened to the clip twice, then closed his laptop. No tears came. Not from regret. Not from sorrow. Just stillness. A soft kind. The kind that follows a storm that didn't destroy your house, but showed you all the places it had been leaking for years. He stood by the window of his apartment that night, watching the street below flicker with headlamps and vendors, and the urgent pulse of Lagos life. And for the first time, he didn't wonder where she was or what she was thinking. He simply hoped she was warm. That her breath came easy. That her silence now was by choice, not necessity. And he knew, deep in his chest, that some endings don't echo loudly, they just settle. And when they do, all that's left is what you carry forward and what you finally choose to put down. Sometimes the loudest kind of pain is the one that comes from silence. The words we never said, the people we didn't show up for, the truths we were too afraid to face. Don't wait until love becomes a regret. Pay attention while it still whispers. Show up for those who trust you, because when trust dies, it rarely comes back the same. And if life gives you a second chance, don't waste it trying to look innocent. Use it to make things right. May you never be absent when your presence is needed most. May the people who count on you never find you unavailable at the hour their world begins to crack. May your silence never be mistaken for indifference, and may your voice always rise in truth and not in defense. May you have the courage to listen when it's hardest, and the wisdom to speak when silence would hurt. May healing find you where heartbreak once lived, and may love, the honest kind, locate you and never lose you again. May your name be safe in the mouths of those who remember you. May your peace be deep, your soul light, and your heart always bold enough to choose what's right. And may every loss you've ever endured be transformed into strength you didn't know you had. If you believe this, let your spirit say, Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.